The judge raised his gavel. Verdict was moments away. Then 13-year-old Olivia stood. "Your Honor, we need to re-examine the evidence, because the real criminal is in this room." Silence. A gasp. The prosecutor's face went pale. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. Before we dive into this gripping courtroom drama, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We bring you the most compelling legal battles, untold stories of justice, and jaw-dropping courtroom moments every day. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Justice has never been this intense. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a cold glow over the courtroom. The air was thick with expectation, the weight of the trial pressing down on everyone in attendance. Olivia Carter stood motionless, gripping the papers in her trembling hands. Judge Lawrence Miller watched her carefully. He had seen many desperate pleas in his courtroom, but never from a 13-year-old girl standing in defense of her father. There was something unsettling about her composure. No frantic tears, no emotional outburst, just raw determination. Thomas Gray, the prosecutor, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His smirk barely concealed his amusement. "This ought to be good," he muttered under his breath. Olivia ignored him. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked toward the evidence table. "My father was home when this crime took place," she said firmly, "and I can prove it." A sharp scoff from Gray. "This is nonsense. Your Honor, are we seriously entertaining?" Judge Miller held up a hand. "Let her speak." Gray exhaled sharply but said nothing. Olivia reached into her folder and pulled out a document, stepping closer to the judge's bench. "This is my father's phone record from the night of the robbery," she continued. "It shows a call made to my phone at exactly 10:23 p.m. That's the same time the burglary was happening." She turned to the jury, making sure her voice didn't waver. "We talked for 6 minutes. He was reminding me to lock the doors before bed." She placed the phone records on the table, sliding them toward the judge. The courtroom, which had been a low murmur of whispers moments ago, was silent now. Judge Miller leaned forward, studying the document. His expression remained neutral, but Olivia saw the flicker of thought behind his eyes. Gray, however, chuckled. "So what?" he said dismissively. "That call could have been pre-recorded. Or maybe he stepped outside, made the call, then went back to commit the crime." Olivia was ready for this. She reached for another sheet of paper. "This is the official police report," she said, her voice tightening. "It states that the intruder was left-handed." She turned to face her father. "Dad, can you pick up that pen?" James hesitated, but when she nodded at him reassuringly, he did as she asked. He grabbed the pen, instinctively with his right hand. "My father is right-handed," Olivia said, turning back to the judge. "Always has been." Murmurs rippled through the room once more. The jury members exchanged glances. Judge Miller rested his chin on his fist, watching the scene unfold. Gray's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "This doesn't mean anything," he said. "Plenty of right-handed people can use their left hand." Olivia clenched her jaw. She knew she was chipping away at their case, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She reached into her folder again and pulled out another document. "This is the crime scene photo," she said, holding it up. "It was submitted as evidence 2 days ago. I studied it carefully." She walked toward the jury box, making sure each juror could see the image. "You see the way the cash drawer was opened?" she asked. "It was pulled from the left side. The angle suggests someone using their dominant left hand to yank it open forcefully." A low murmur swept through the room. Olivia turned back toward the judge. "My father would have pulled it the other way." A moment of silence. Even Gray didn't have an immediate response. He shifted in his seat. Judge Miller exhaled through his nose, tapping his gavel lightly against his desk. "This is compelling," he admitted. Olivia wasn't finished. She took a final deep breath. And there's one more thing, she said, stepping forward. Gray finally snapped. This has gone far enough, he said, slamming a hand on his desk. Your Honor, she is not a lawyer. She is a child. She is wasting the court's time. Olivia turned sharply toward him, her face unreadable. If I'm wasting your time, then why are you getting nervous? Gray flinched. Olivia didn't wait for him to respond. She picked up another document and held it up. This is the police department's financial record from last month, she said. It shows that Detective Spencer, the lead investigator on this case, received an unusual deposit of $10,000 into his personal account, one day before my father was arrested. A sharp gasp filled the courtroom. Gray's face drained of color. Judge Miller straightened in his chair. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Carter? Olivia looked directly at him. That someone paid Detective Spencer to frame my father. Chaos erupted. The jury whispered in alarm. The gallery broke into frantic murmurs. Even James Carter, who had remained silent the entire time, looked at his daughter in shock. Gray jumped to his feet. Objection! This is outrageous. She has no proof of bribery. Judge Miller banged his gavel. Order in the court. The room reluctantly quieted. Olivia stood firm. I have a witness, she said. The bank manager who flagged the transaction. She turned toward the courtroom doors. He's outside right now. The judge exchanged a glance with the bailiff, then nodded. Bring him in. A moment later, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. A middle-aged man in a gray suit walked in, looking slightly nervous. My name is Robert Hayes, he introduced himself. I work at First National Bank. He adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat. And yes, I flagged that deposit as suspicious. Silence. The tension in the air was suffocating. Olivia turned back to the judge. The prosecution claimed this was an open and shut case, she said quietly, but they ignored the details. She took a step back, folding her hands in front of her. Your Honor, I respectfully request that this trial does not end today. Judge Miller studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to the prosecution table. Mr. Gray, he said, his voice calm but firm. I believe the defense has just raised reasonable doubt. Gray's jaw clenched, but Olivia already knew. She had just changed everything. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Olivia Carter stood at the center of it, gripping her papers with white-knuckled determination. The jury's eyes were now fixed on her, their skepticism starting to waver. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she couldn't afford to falter. Not now. Prosecutor Thomas Gray leaned against his table, arms crossed, his expression a mask of forced confidence. This doesn't prove anything, he repeated, his voice sharp. Your father could still be involved. You're grasping at straws, Miss Carter. Olivia inhaled slowly, steadying herself. No, I'm exposing yours. Gray's eyes darkened, but before he could cut her off, she reached into her stack of documents again. This, she said, pulling out another sheet, is the witness statement from the store owner, Mr. Leonard Fisher. She walked over to the evidence table and laid the paper down. Mr. Fisher, who saw the suspect that night, described him as having a deep scar on his left hand. He was very clear about that in his original statement. She turned toward her father. Dad, can you show the court your left hand? James Carter hesitated for a second before lifting his hand for all to see. It was clean, no scars, no marks. Olivia looked back at the jury. Not a single scar. Murmurs broke out in the jury box. Even Judge Miller sat up straighter, his brows knitted in thought. Gray let out a short, irritated breath and forced a smirk. Witnesses misremember details all the time, he said dismissively. This doesn't dismantle our case. Olivia narrowed her eyes. Then let's talk about something that doesn't rely on memory, she countered. She pulled out yet another document. This is the crime scene forensic report. she said. Specifically, the shoe prints found near the broken window where the thief entered. Gray's smirk faltered for just a second. She continued. The report states that the shoe size of the suspect is a 10.5. Olivia turned to her father again. Dad, what size do you wear? James exhaled, then answered. 12. Another ripple of whispers swept through the jury box. Olivia didn't stop. She needed to keep pushing, keep widening the cracks in the prosecution's case until it all collapsed. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution wants everyone to believe this is an open and shut case, she said, her voice clear and strong. But if it were, why are there so many inconsistencies? She lifted her fingers, counting off each point. The timestamp doesn't match. The handedness doesn't match. The physical description doesn't match. The shoe size doesn't match. She took a step closer to the judge's bench. This is not my father. Judge Miller exhaled heavily, folding his hands together as he considered her words. Prosecutor Gray, however, wasn't giving up so easily. All right, he said, voice tight. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that your father wasn't the one inside the store that night. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved. He could have been waiting outside. He could have planned the whole thing. Olivia clenched her fists, the frustration boiling in her chest. She had already exposed so many holes, and yet they were still trying to force the same narrative. Then a thought struck her. Something bigger. Something that could change everything. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, may I approach the prosecution's table? Gray's eyebrows shot up. Absolutely not. Judge Miller, however, was intrigued. I'll allow it. Gray stiffened as Olivia walked over to his table. She carefully picked up a printed photo that had been used as evidence. The blurry security footage showing the suspect mid-stride, hooded and moving toward the cash register. Olivia studied it closely. Then she flipped it over. The prosecution was very quick to present this image as the key piece of evidence, she said, her voice calm but sharp. But there's something they didn't bother checking. She turned it so the entire courtroom could see the back of the image. It was a printout from a security company. The timestamp on the back was different from the one in the case file. Gray stiffened. Olivia's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she pointed to the discrepancy. The footage was altered, she announced. Gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Miller leaned forward, his face hardening. Explain. Olivia turned the photo back around, holding it up for everyone. The timestamp on the official evidence says 10:23 p.m., the exact time the crime was supposedly happening. She flipped it again, her fingers tapping the back of the printout. But the original system log from the security company shows that this image was actually pulled at 9:47 p.m., 36 minutes before the crime even took place. A stunned silence filled the room. Judge Miller's face darkened. He turned sharply toward Gray. Mr. Gray, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Gray opened his mouth, but no words came out. A bead of sweat trailed down his temple. Olivia watched him carefully. She could see it, the panic, the realization that his case was crumbling. And she wasn't done yet. Your Honor, she said, if the security footage was tampered with, that means someone wanted to make sure my father was blamed. She let that sink in before delivering her final blow. And if someone went through the trouble of planting false evidence, then that means the real criminal is still out there. The jury was no longer whispering. They were staring at Olivia, wide-eyed, hanging on every word. Judge Miller's expression was unreadable, but his next words sent another ripple of tension through the room. We need to pause this trial, he said, his voice grave. Immediately. Olivia's fingers loosened around the paper in her hands. She had done it. She had forced them to stop. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom was a storm of voices. Gasps, murmurs, hurried whispers spreading like wildfire. Judge Miller's gavel slammed down, the sharp crack echoing through the tense air. "Order in the court," he commanded. The noise died down, but the weight of Olivia's accusation still hung heavy in the air. At the prosecution's table, Thomas Gray looked shaken for the first time. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. "This is ridiculous," he hissed. "You're letting a child hijack a serious legal proceeding with wild conspiracy theories, Your Honor." Judge Miller ignored him and turned his gaze toward Olivia. "You claim Detective Spencer was bribed," he said, his voice measured but sharp. "That's an extraordinary allegation. Do you have anything to substantiate this claim?" Olivia met his eyes without hesitation. "I do," she said, stepping forward. She lifted another document from her stack and laid it flat on the evidence table. "This is the transaction report from First National Bank. It shows that a deposit of $10,000 was made to Detective Spencer's personal account, 1 day before my father was arrested." She pointed at the numbers highlighted in bold. "And this payment came from an untraceable offshore account." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Miller took the document and scanned it carefully. His brows furrowed. He passed it to the clerk, who moved to make a copy for the case files. Gray let out a sharp breath, trying to regain control. "This is not proof of bribery," he argued. "A deposit does not indicate corruption. There could be 100 explanations for this money." Olivia didn't even blink. "I thought you'd say that." She reached into her folder and pulled out another document. "This is the flagged transaction report," she said, laying it beside the first one. "It was flagged by the bank's fraud detection system because the deposit had no clear source." She turned to the judge. "When I found this, I contacted the bank." She turned toward the back of the courtroom. "And the bank manager who flagged the transaction is here, ready to testify." Judge Miller glanced at the bailiff. "Bring him in." The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and a middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped inside. He looked nervous, adjusting his glasses as he approached the witness stand. The clerk swore him in, and then Judge Miller addressed him. "State your name and occupation for the record." The man cleared his throat. "My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the senior financial analyst at First National Bank." Judge Miller nodded. "And do you recognize this transaction?" Hayes glanced at the document Olivia had presented, then looked back at the judge. "Yes," he said, his voice firm despite his nerves. "I personally flagged it as suspicious last month. A $10,000 deposit from an unknown entity made to an account belonging to Detective Spencer." Another wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Olivia turned to Gray, her expression unreadable. "You were saying?" Gray's jaw clenched. Judge Miller leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes, can you elaborate on why you flagged this deposit?" Hayes nodded. "The funds were wired through a shell corporation registered offshore. This kind of movement is often associated with money laundering or undisclosed payments." "Bribes," Olivia clarified. Hayes hesitated, then gave a small nod. "In many cases, yes." Gray shot up from his chair. "Objection. This is pure speculation. There is zero evidence tying this to my case." Judge Miller turned to Olivia. "Do you have more?" She nodded. "I looked into Detective Spencer's financial records," she said, pulling out another document. "In the last 2 years, he has received several untraceable deposits, all in increments of $10,000 to $15,000. She laid them out one by one. And every time, these deposits appeared right before he arrested someone in a high-profile case. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Even the jury, who had maintained neutral expressions throughout most of the trial, looked visibly shaken. Judge Miller turned to Gray, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Gray, Is the prosecution aware of these financial transactions? Gray's mouth opened and closed. We were not informed of any. He hesitated, sweat now visible on his temple. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to this case. Irrelevant? Olivia's voice was sharp, unwavering. You built this entire case on Detective Spencer's investigation. If he's been accepting money to frame people, how can you be sure my father's arrest wasn't just another setup? Gray inhaled through his nose, his frustration barely concealed. Judge Miller leaned back in his chair. His fingers drummed against the bench, his expression contemplative. Finally, he turned back to Hayes. Mr. Hayes, in your professional opinion, would a pattern of these deposits warrant further investigation? Hayes straightened. Absolutely, Your Honor. Judge Miller nodded, turning back to Gray. This is relevant, he said firmly, and it will be investigated. Gray's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Olivia watched him, then turned back to the judge. There's something else. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Olivia reached into her folder one last time and pulled out another document. This is a sworn statement, she said, from someone inside the police department. Gray's eyes snapped to her, his entire body going rigid. She let the weight of her words settle before she continued. This person admitted that Detective Spencer has been tampering with evidence for years. A shockwave hit the courtroom. The jury was no longer just watching. They were absorbing, processing, believing. Judge Miller slowly exhaled. This changes things, he said, his voice low but final. For the first time, Gray looked genuinely afraid. And Olivia Carter knew. She had just won the first real battle. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye was on Judge Lawrence Miller as he sat motionless, his hands folded, his gaze heavy with contemplation. The weight of Olivia's evidence had shifted the entire trial, and now, for the first time, the so-called airtight case against James Carter was unraveling before everyone's eyes. This new evidence, Judge Miller finally said, his voice measured but firm, casts significant doubt on the integrity of this case. A murmur swept through the jury. The expressions on their faces had changed, from detached indifference to uncertainty, some even to quiet outrage. At the prosecution's table, Thomas Gray's knuckles were white as he gripped the edges of his desk. His confidence, so unwavering at the start of the trial, was gone. He was a man who had just realized he was on the wrong side of history. He swallowed hard. I request an adjournment to review this information. His voice was stiff, controlled, but the cracks in his composure were beginning to show. Judge Miller barely spared him a glance. No need, he said. His tone was final. This case is dismissed on the grounds of misconduct and insufficient evidence. A beat of silence. Then, chaos. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, voices overlapping, a sharp cry from the back of the room. The gallery was a storm of emotions, some people cheering, others too stunned to speak. The sound of the gavel hammering down barely broke through the noise, but Olivia barely heard any of it. Her father turned to her, his face unreadable for a split second before emotion finally cracked through. His hands trembled as he reached for her. And then she ran to him. James Carter wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her tight, as though she might vanish if he let go. Olivia buried her face in his chest, feeling his heartbeat, steady and real. You did it, he whispered, his voice rough with disbelief. Liv, you did it. She squeezed her eyes shut, letting the relief crash over her. He was free. The nightmare was over. Behind them, the jury was already being ushered out, reporters whispering furiously, their pens scratching against notepads. Some people in the audience applauded. Others sat in stunned silence, still trying to process what had just happened. Olivia turned, her eyes scanning the room. Prosecutor Gray was silent, his face stone cold as he gathered his papers. He wouldn't look at her, wouldn't acknowledge her. The once smug attorney who had treated her like a nuisance now looked like a man who had lost. For the first time in the entire trial, he had nothing to say. But it wasn't Gray Olivia was looking for. Her gaze landed on Judge Miller. Unlike Gray, he was watching her. His sharp, discerning eyes studied her carefully, like a man reassessing something, or someone, he had underestimated. There was no condescension in his expression now, no dismissal. Finally, as she met his gaze, the corners of his mouth barely moved, but she caught the words. "Well played, Miss Carter." She didn't reply. She only nodded, holding her father's hand a little tighter, and then they turned toward the doors. The second they stepped into the hallway, they were met with a wall of reporters. Flashbulbs exploded in their faces. A swarm of voices overlapped in a frenzy of shouted questions. "Olivia! Olivia! How did you figure it out? Did you always believe your father was innocent? What's next for you?" The cameras shoved forward, voices pushing at her from every direction. It was overwhelming, but Olivia barely flinched. She just smiled. "I just did what was right," she said simply. The reporters erupted into more frantic questioning, but she didn't stay to answer. She turned back to her father, feeling his warm hand around hers, solid and real. Together, they walked forward, through the cameras, past the flashing lights, past the noise. As they moved, Olivia glanced up at him, watching as the tension in his face slowly melted away. He looked down at her, his eyes full of something deeper than gratitude, pride. And with that, Olivia Carter walked out of the courthouse, not just a girl, but a symbol of what justice should truly be. Before we dive into this gripping courtroom drama, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We bring you the most compelling legal battles, untold stories of justice, and jaw-dropping courtroom moments every day. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Justice has never been this intense.